Yeah, something that I've thought about a bit more over this season, and especially after this weekend, is with everything being so tight, I do think there's something to be said about bike setup, because I've talked to Greg quite a lot about this. He talks about a fast bike and a slow bike, and you sort of have a slower bike that is way more forgiving, and you're the one that's inputting the speed into that bike. And then you've got the opposite, where you've got a fast bike that wants to jump out of corners, accelerating everywhere, much faster in terms of rebound, but it's a lot more dangerous. If something goes wrong, you're getting bounced off that bike. And when you see Loic's bike from a few years ago, that was definitely a fast bike. And when things went wrong, his sort of pogo sticked him off. I think his bike has been a little bit more refined again. And funnily enough, after semis, I wanted to go up and see how the track was developing. We hadn't, from Norco's point of view, it hadn't been a good day. And I'll touch on that in a minute because there's some interesting insights, I think, from that. But I wanted to see the track, and Loic was on track. And I said, I tell you what, your bike is working bloody well. And he sort of smiled at me and he goes, you just have to work harder, Alan. You just have to work harder. And it was said in such a nice way. I was like, I'm glad you're here. You know what I mean? I need people like you here because it keeps us really working hard. And because he's putting that effort into the bike, he's putting the effort into himself. And I think there's a fine line to be said, not only on the rider, but also on that bike setup. Because if you get a bike setup wrong, Gracie's bike wasn't great in Fort William for the rocks. It was too slow. And it just packs down rock after rock after rock. And all of a sudden you're feeling every bump and you're not carrying any momentum. And the bike sort of got its brake on almost. But you go the other way and you have a really fast bike and you've got a risk of crashing. So that side of things is always something that I find fascinating. And when Greg went up for his run, he felt that something wasn't right on the rear end, on the shock. It just wasn't as he wanted it as he was going to the lift. And he had to sort of ride within it. And they dynoed it afterwards and the shock had basically blown. And that's really frustrating because he'd come down with a run that was safe and smooth and thought, well, is that going to be enough? But it obviously just wasn't anywhere near because it was too safe and smooth, and he couldn't push on because the bike wasn't sort of safe to do so. So I do think that now we're getting to that point where everything has to be refined. I don't think there's necessarily a good bike or a bad bike, but I do think there's a good setup and a bad setup.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So where do you think Loic's gone? He's found the happy medium, because he did say he's happy with his setup, right? So you think he's found this happy medium where he's somehow got some comfort, but it's fast enough that he's risking some sort of crashes here and there?
Yeah, I think when you watch his bike after the apex of a corner, it's just pulling. It's like I'm riding a 450 and it's just wanting to jump forward. And that's just my observation. And when you put it next to a bike that's not working quite so well, you can see that difference. But maybe he's managed to get it so that it doesn't quite fully extend and bounce him, maybe risk a bigger crash. He's got a super wily, his old mechanic, Jack, has been around for a long time. I think he was Celine Gross's mechanic from back in the day. He worked with Danny on Lapierre. He's been around for a long time. They've got good support on that team for bikes, and teams are definitely stepping up. But when you take it down a couple of levels in terms of team support, and you look at Danny's setup, for example, Danny isn't the greatest at setting up the bike. And I'll say this to Danny. Danny won't, he won't be annoyed at me saying this, I don't think. He'll ride probably quite a slow and safe bike. It's probably quite controlled, and Danny's the one putting in the speed. But at this level, when Danny says the run wasn't too bad, it was okay, but he's not where he wants to be. I honestly think that if you were to really refine a bike setup, it might give you, if you were testing against the clock, if that gives you 2 seconds on a track, that's light years ahead. 3:01, and you're in the top 15 with 3 seconds. So I think this stuff really has to be considered. It's a really holistic approach. Are you strong enough to hold on to it? Are you fit enough to ride all the way down and sprint at the bottom? Is your bike set up properly? Yeah, it all comes into play, doesn't it?
No, it definitely does. It's always been like an all-round thing. The challenge I'm seeing is people seeing Loic do so well. But you got someone like Ronan. Look, he's got, I think I missed it, but he's Mark Morrison on his bike. Or at least he's in the
Mark's.
in the
I don't know if
Mondraker
Mark's
team,
on his
right?
bike, but yeah, Mark's in the pits. Yeah, Mark's.
So there's a lot of experience there. Definitely, I'm not saying the bike's not set up fine, but I feel like he's racing even a suboptimal bike setup, and the riding's doing the talking. You know, so like I think you can also fall victim to like looking over the tent and going, okay, they've got this, they're doing this. So it's such a fine line to help the riders realize, like, hey, the riding does still do the talking. Maybe your bike's not set up perfect. Obviously, you want a safe bike and something like that. You don't just go for speed and it's like chaotic to ride. And it's so stiff and tires are super firm. You know, like, yes, you can build a super fast one-run bike, but it's not sustainable. But what I'm getting at is such a tough position to be at, because this is like the season of tech, where the tech people have been working on is now coming sort of to the front of the race series, like the electronic suspension, this. And it must be tough. Someone like Danny, maybe, okay, I don't quite have this factory support. Like, how do I compete? So that's like such a fine line, because I still think, like, you know, the riding clearly can do the talking. Like, Lachlan definitely didn't have all the support as a top rider, and he's showing it in the split.
This is it. And if someone gave you budget, someone said, right, Andrew, I've got some extra budget for you. You've come to the race. You've got no one up on track to help you. You've got your mechanic, but you've got no suspension tech. Where'd you put your money? You know, is it better to have someone on track filming and feeding back to you and say, hey, man, you're on the wrong line here. You're wasting 3 runs. You need to change. Or look at your track speed versus someone else. You're absolutely brilliant. Don't try and overcook this section. You're just fine. Is that more beneficial from a coaching angle than having some wizard on the data logger set your bike up and go, well, the bike's fine, mate, and you're going, well, what am I doing wrong? You know, it does come back down to the riding, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's such a fine line. I was going to say, unfortunately, it depends on the rider if they need some confirmation online so that they stop doubting, or do they need some confirmation on the bike to stop doubting? You know, it's such a fine line. And you know, we had races where I'd always want our support crew there, but Danny and I still did well despite them not being there. So, you know, you still have to build your own sort of self-confidence. You have to build your own process and all those sort of things. And I think when you're feeling good and you're confident, you're probably relying less on the guys, even though they're there. It's like, yep, thanks, cool, right. You confirmed what I was already going to do. You confirmed how I'm thinking. So that's pretty damn interesting.